Ladies and gentlemen, if you would be so kind as to move all the way down to the right. If you're sitting down, we've still got a bit of a queue of people out there trying to get in. So the more spaces we can free up, the better. Please move all the way down to the right. Fill up all the free chairs.
To knock it out of the park for those 20 minutes rather than which end through.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this question time event in the ThinkTent between the Taxpayers Alliance and Popular Conservatism. Thrilled so many of you have managed to get into this room, which has been rather overflowing, given our rather stellar list of guests so far, which we are continuing with now. If I could begin by introducing our panel. Many of you will know John O'Connell, the Chief Executive of the Taxpayers Alliance, who is living proof that you can have a job and work your way up to great success and change things as you go. He has been at the Taxpayers Alliance since 2009, representing each and every one of us in this room to make sure we have the openness, the transparency in where our tax money goes, how it's spent, and putting forward ideas to make sure it isn't wasted, as governments are so wont to do. Dr. Ted Bromond spent 15 years working for the Thatcher Foundation for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. I'm having a complete blank, in Washington, D.C., and is extremely knowledgeable not only on the principles of freedom, but also Anglo-American relations. To my right, presumably your left, very unusually therefore, I have Mark Littlewood, who I am reliably informed is a recovering Lib Dem. However, having been through rehab, he has come out the other side extremely sound and is the direct...
Fully recovered.
Fully recovered. And having been the head of the IEA for over a decade, is now the director of Popular Conservatism, or PopCon, as it gets shortened to. Dr. David Starkey needs little or no introduction, a renowned author, historian, and now, I am told, YouTube sensation with over 130,000 subscribers.
250, get it right.
As you can see, we have a great array of talents, and I'm hoping that all of you will start thinking of brilliant questions to probe the future of the principles that all of them are here to defend, to argue for, and to extol amongst not only the people at this conference, but across the country and beyond. If I could start with that very basic question for the panel of, we're all gathered in Birmingham as Conservatives. That doesn't mean all the panel are Conservatives, but that is why all of us are here, to find out where Conservatism is going. We have just suffered as a party a historic defeat. And yet, much to my surprise, we seem to have turned up to one of the jolliest Conservative Party conferences I can remember in years. It is quite extraordinary. I have heard from Labour friends, I do have Labour friends, that it was very downbeat and rather sad at Labour Party conference, which is ironic given the enormous majority they'd just won. But that enormous majority was very broad, but very narrow. Their majorities are small, their problems immense within their party and outside of it. Having lost so many MPs, having lost the election, the Conservatives and the entire Conservative movement in this country actually has a historic opportunity to refind itself, reform itself, bring itself together and take the fight forward. That is what I would like the panel to think about. That if we look at the big issues as a Conservative with a small c country, the ideas of freedom that we all support, the low tax so that people can spend their own money, the sovereignty we all demand to be defended. How can we get those ideas across? How can we make them as popular as we know they are without the left again taking the narrative and wanting more state, higher taxes and destroying our economy? John, if we could start with you.
Well, thank you very much, Annunziata. I'll be very pithy on this first remark. I think that if and when a Conservative leader returns to number 10 Downing Street, one thing I'd like to see them do is not just take the bequest of the outgoing administration and start to build new laws on top of that, but to actively go back and repeal lots and lots of bad things that have been put onto the statute books over the course of the last 2 decades. I think it's all well and good for me to talk about reducing the tax burden and government transparency. All great stuff. Want that to happen. But we need to go back and undo lots and lots of damaging regulations and laws.
And David Starkey, what are the historic parallels with the ability of governments to actually achieve what John suggested, to undo the ever-increasing legal system, the quangos, the system of government?
They're very clear. It was done from 1974 onwards. We are it's exactly 50 years on. 50 years ago, Keith Joseph, after the shattering defeat of Edward Heath in that general election, recognised exactly what Robert Jenrick did, that the party got it wrong. Fundamentally, the party became a broad church, the so-called Buckskalite of Labour, Lib, Conservatism, in fact, the coalition of the Second World War. And then what they realised was they had to undo exactly what John was saying. You have to undo before you do. So, in fact, Robert Jenrick got it wrong. We don't want a Great Reform Act. We want a Great Repeal Act to be followed by a restoration, which reminds us we actually reversed a real revolution in the 17th century. And if you look back, the resemblances, admittedly, there were great men then, and we've now got Keir Starmer. But if you actually look at what the Puritans did, what the Puritan regime of the 1650s did, it's astonishingly similar. It is centralizing, constitutionally experimental. It imposes shocking limitations on freedom. It destroys the basic parliamentary constitution. That's the challenge. We've got to put it back and explain that's what really meant taking back control means. Taking back control is the restoration of a parliamentary constitution which is firmly grounded in popular sovereignty. Because what the left has done is pervert words. Democracy now no longer means majority rule. It means the rule of minorities. We've totally stood it on its head. This is actually said by Lord Bingham, the founder of the Supreme Court. And this is why we've had to invent this word populism. Populism means what old democracy means. So rather than being ashamed of it, we've got to embrace it. We've got to recapture language.
Now, Ted, obviously, you know a huge amount about American politics, and populism is a word quite frequently associated with Trump. But his policies aren't always actually of the right, that there are freedoms he supports, but there are protections he also supports that are rather contradictory to me in his philosophy. But how can we in the UK bring forward that populist idea that we should have true freedoms here?
I think it goes far beyond just what's happening in the United States. The United States, the UK, and all of the European countries are experiencing something very similar. Look across all of Western and indeed a lot of Eastern Europe. Find me a traditional center-right party that has survived the last 10 to 15 years. They're almost all gone. The Gaullists in France have been completely destroyed. The traditional Christian right in Italy has been vaporized. It's the US and the UK who still have broadly center-right parties, and it's not looking very healthy in the UK right now. What the US is doing, what the right is doing in the United States, sometimes, I agree very falteringly, is trying to respond to the same challenge. Dr. Starkey has called it populism. I dare say Mark would say something very, very similar. It's trying to respond to this challenge of a new class that has imposed a set of ideals on speech, on the economy, on government, on regulation, that have alienated them from a large part of the public and have given them the outlet of populism. The parties in Europe that haven't responded to that have been destroyed. They've been eaten away on the right. And the conservatives in the United Kingdom, just like the Republicans in the United States, are going to have to come to grips with that phenomena. I recognize that the UK has got its own political culture, which is separate, thank God, from that of Europe, but we all face similar challenges. And if we don't come to grips with those challenges, our center-right parties will go the way of the center-right parties of Europe. And that would be a tragedy.
And Mark, in terms of populism and repealing to return our freedoms, where do you see the country heading, or where should it be heading?
Well, I was delighted at the start, I think, Annunziata, that you said this was a question time panel of the popcons against the taxpayers' rights. Just want to assure you, however low John wants tax, I want it lower still. But I'm very happy to get into an auction on that one. But I think this is a sort of, in some ways, a depressing time. But in some ways, you can see the shot on the board. You can see the chance. I mean, if you look back to, let's just reflect a bit on the results of July the 4th. As the great comedians Peter Cook and Dudley Moore would have said, I wouldn't describe it as a disaster, more of a catastrophe. And that was the scale of it, and that is the wake-up call. If this party, this great party, does not listen and respond and become a vehicle for a great democratic restoration, we're going to be out of it. We are finished. We will slowly, or actually probably quite rapidly, decline. Ted, you were saying about how other long-standing parties in Western Europe are being vaporised. You know, the end could come pretty quickly if we don't get our act together. But there is an opportunity here, because in just a few short weeks we've seen how utterly wretched this government is. And I think it's the mission of the Conservative Party to plant the flag in the ground and be the rallying cry for the rebel alliance against this absolutely monstrous regime, which is going to get worse and worse with each passing month. But it's not enough to oppose. I've got a lot of sympathy for people who switched and voted for Reform. I've got a lot of friends in Reform UK. But the Conservative Party needs to find the prescription. And I think if you were in this session earlier with Robert Jenrick, he was getting towards that. I think David Starkey has basically worked it out. We need to unravel the catastrophic bureaucratic state that has been allowed to grow up and govern our lives without democratic parliamentary accountability. Now, that is a constitutional point that you might think doesn't actually get raised on the doorstep when people are arguing about traffic calming measures or the rest of it. But my sense is that the British people already, and it will increasingly be the case, are thinking in terms of drain the swamp, Westminster doesn't listen, I feel wholly disempowered. And if we become the party that offers a full democratic restoration, I think we can win the next election in one fell swoop.
That leads me on, Mark. I very much agree with you. I think there is an opportunity. But we are, whether we like it or not, facing 5 years of hard labour. Their majority is too large, despite the fact they seem to be thoroughly enjoying falling out with each other in every direction possible except for to the right. We can't get rid of them. There is no mechanism for us to decide enough is enough. But what can we do to prepare during the next 5 years to make sure not only can we win the next election, but we can make our country great again once it's out of socialist hands? Perhaps, Ted, you could start.
I think Britain's great already. I'm more worried about making the Conservative Party great again than I am with making Britain great again. But I would start with something that John has said. Governing is really hard. I mean, no wonder the Labour conference this year was a little bit depressed. Being in government is really difficult. It means having to make decisions. Unfortunately, sometimes it does mean compromises. It means you don't always get everything you want. That's sometimes very depressing. If I had to make one criticism of the Conservative governments since 2010 in the United Kingdom, is that there was far too little attention devoted to the hard work of actually governing, of making difficult choices and pushing them through in legislation. And I don't just blame the ministers for that. I blame backbench MPs as well. I blame the unwillingness to come to grips with the civil service. I blame the fear of taking measures that would be unpopular now, never mind the long-term results that might bear fruit by the time of the next election. So I think the most important thing is, yes, and we need to talk about ideas, that's important, but I think there's probably a pretty broad agreement, at least in this room and in the Conservative Party as a whole, vastly reduced as it is, about the general ideas that we're in favor of. We need to raise up a group of people as candidates, as CCHQ workers, as canvassers and local party and local councils who not just believe in these ideas, but are willing to do the hard work to put them into practice. That's difficult, but that's the job of a party in opposition, to prepare not just for government intellectually, but prepare for the hard work of actually governing.
Just 2 quick points from me. Mark, you mentioned the sort of the mundane, the everyday, the potholes in the road, the traffic outside someone's house. I think the trick over the next 5 years is to explain to people why that is a consequence of the bureaucratic state. You know, we can talk in the abstract about the bureaucratic state and unpicking it and all the rest of it, but what does it actually mean to somebody? And I think the Canadians are doing that really well at the moment, hence the large amount of support they have for that and other reasons. And the other thing is talking about trade-offs. I hear lots of talk at these kinds of conferences about, oh, you know, we need to have these honest conversations. Then the minute we have honest conversations, everybody gets scared of the sort of what happens on Twitter and all this kind of thing. I think we need to be a bit bolder and have a bit of spine when we do have these conversations and not freak out every time somebody has a different idea.
Dr. Starkey.
Well, I think I'm really looking forward to this next 5 years. I think it's going to be wonderful for conservatism. But what we've got to do, we've got to explain to everybody that this terrible blob we've spoken about, the civil service, the judiciary, the universities, the quangos, it's got a single representative, and it's called the Labour Party. The Labour Party owns this mess. The Labour Party created this mess. The Labour Party cannot correct this mess. Our job is to pin every single disaster on them. And the disasters, ladies and gentlemen, will be legion. It'll be horrible for the country. From our point of view, it will be absolutely excellent. But we've got to explain. We've got to show what's gone wrong and why we should be saying now, I'm a historian, but I believe at this moment you can prophesy. This government is going to fail. It is going to fail resoundingly and crashingly, and these are the reasons why. You created the mess. You represent the mess. You benefit from the mess, and you cannot change it. We can.
Yeah.
Simple as that.
I'm trying to share David's enthusiasm. I think I have it a bit, but it reminds me...
It's going to be terrible.
Yeah, it's going to be terrible. I mean, it reminds me a bit of my tenure at the IEA when I worked out after a few years that the worse things got for Britain, the better they got for the Institute of Economic Affairs. And it sort of feels a bit the same now. The more socialism we get now, probably the greater the revival of conservatism will be. But it is going to be a grim few years. I agree with David. I mean, the intriguing thing is that it's pretty evident that this government doesn't have any form of lodestar at all. It is basically taking all of the things the previous Conservative administration did wrong, and it's doubling down on those.
Absolutely.
So the Labour Party prescription seems to be that what's gone wrong in Britain over the past 15 years is that we haven't taxed enough, we haven't borrowed enough, we haven't spent enough, and we haven't regulated enough.
And not enough immigration.
And not enough
we
immigration.
Want much more. Yes.
I mean, it is going to be grim and bad for the country, but this party is the vehicle for getting them out in 5 years' time. I agree with you. It's difficult to see a scenario in which the government collapses before then. Not wholly impossible. We just need another 95 Rosie Duffields, and we'll be there on a no confidence vote. The government might collapse, but we're probably in for a 5-year stint, I fear. But we've got to be absolutely ready and able. And the Canadian Conservatives are a great example here. The Canadian Conservative Party aren't just ahead. They are ahead in every demographic and age cohort in Canada. And that's what we need to aspire to as well. There's a huge amount of work to be done in different cohorts. I was speaking at an event yesterday on young people on the right. Does anybody want to hazard a guess on the proportion of the vote that we would have got amongst 16 and 17-year-olds, not eligible to vote, but this was 2 days before the last election? How many 16 and 17-year-olds said they would vote Conservative?
I know it's 2%.
5%. It was actually 5%. Amongst 16 and 17-year-old boys, we were on 11%. Amongst 16 and 17-year-old girls, we were on 0%. So we're going to have to do rather better than double that score, right? Because that won't be any progress at all. So there's a huge task to be done. It needs to be done methodically, but it's not ours to lose. But I think things will become so bad so fast that a compelling conservative vision, unalloyed conservatism, not running on some mishmash social democratic ticket that we, I think, did in last time round, there's every chance of it winning. And you know what? If it doesn't, I'd at least like to think that we go down fighting for something we actually believe in, rather than running on some middle-of-the-road platform of we'll just make sure decline doesn't happen as rapidly as the other lot. We've got to make this into a clear ideological fight.
I am no Fiona Bruce, but this is question time. And therefore, I would like to hand over the questions to all of you. If you could put your hands up, microphones will be coming round. I will take 3 questions at a time for the panel to answer. If you could introduce yourself with your name and where you're from, that would be very kind.
Michael Bracken from Cheshire and Amersham. How would you go about reducing the size of the welfare state? I mean, what lessons are there from our own history, but also countries around the world?
And Hunter, just there.
Thank you. Hunter DeBose from the cities of London and Westminster. Robert Jenrick is campaigning on the premise that the system is broken. And Dr. Starkey has articulated a compelling explanation for why and how it's broken, that the Blair-era constitutional reforms broke it in all manner of ways such that parliamentary sovereignty no longer reigns supreme, such that the democratic will of the people cannot be enacted. I think that's true. I suspect many of us here agree, but these are topics that the average voter doesn't have the time or patience to delve into and understand properly. I'd like to put each of the panelists on the spot to come up with a slogan: drain the swamp, vote, leave, take back control, something of that nature, a leitmotif that will resonate with the voter to convey this message in a way that they'll appreciate and understand.
Thank you. And staying with the front row, the lady there.
Anne-Marie Cooper, Melchman Devices Association. I've been really interested and encouraged to hear a lot about PopCon and attend events over the last few months. I'm particularly interested, though, how much influence, it's all very well to like-minded people here, but how much influence are you having within the parliamentary party of the 121?
Right, so I will take those three. If we could quickly do the last one first. Mark, you're clearly best placed to answer about PopCon.
Yeah, I don't know entirely how to measure it. We've got many thousands of Conservative Party members on our database, having just been set up in February. I didn't expect these events to be quite as full as they are. I'm very pleased by the progress. And we aim to be a grassroots organisation. I think there hasn't been a sufficient voice of the membership. And we're trying to filter that through, not so much actually to, I mean, we do send everything that you send us, we put it into an omnibus and get it to every MP, but we've particularly filtered that through to the 4 leadership campaigns. And I can't be totally sure whether they have listened or whether they have heard, but I would say in at least some instances, things have tilted dramatically in our direction. I doubt that anyone would have a snowball in hell's chance of winning this election if they said, for example, party members have rather too much power and it's important that we double the staffing at CCHQ and that will work everything out. I think we've been quite good in pushing that party reform. And in certain areas, with 1 or 2 candidates, I think we're getting across this wider vision that the Conservatives need to stand not for competent managerialism, but a full constitutional reset. I don't know if you were here for Robert Jenrick just an hour ago. I think he pretty much gets that. I don't know if he will be the next leader. We'll work on the other 3 needing to get it as well, because all of these people are going to be in prominent positions. I'm encouraged. What I'm most encouraged about is I assumed only a relatively small proportion of Conservative Party members would agree with me. I think about 95% agree with me. So if we can marshal that force, then the party will go down this line. And I think that the democratisation of the party will mean that these ideological, philosophical and policy battles become a lot easier to win than if the diminished parliamentary party is in complete control. So I'm pretty encouraged. 9 months in, got to keep building, but not a bad start.
To move on to Michael's question, how do we reduce the welfare state? It feels rather like, John, that it's like government. It's sort of the ever-growing side that has got out of all control and just like a snowball rolling down a hill is increasing its size exponentially. But what can we do to address that?
I think a big part of the problem was COVID, and now there are large sections of the population that expect everything to be done for them at every turn of their life. There needs to be a dose of personal responsibility, I think. We've seen at the TPA that some councils hire people on full-time salaries to go into schools and do teeth brushing with children because they're not being taught at home. And okay, that's all well and good, but where's the personal responsibility there? So I think there needs to be a bit of focus on that, and on the technical side, the way in which the welfare interacts with the tax system is completely messed up too. So the ability for somebody who's seeking a job, wants to take some temporary work, it's very difficult for them to do so because the financial incentive isn't there for them to do so. In fact, it's better off for them just to stay on benefits anyway. So that interaction with the tax system's very important too. And we've got a big problem with out-of-work benefits for people with mental health issues as well. That seems to be something that is reasonably unique to the UK, actually. Our return to work ratios aren't as good as the rest of Europe after COVID. So that's something that we really need to crack, because that bill's getting very quickly out of control.
And Ted, same question, very different look to the welfare state in America. Can we learn lessons from that?
I'm not sure that in the broadest picture it is terribly different. I mean, we all, the US, the UK, Western European countries all face this enormous demographic overhang of large amounts of benefits going to an increasingly, I'm sorry to say, almost now including me, older generation, and younger generations feeling increasingly that they will not be as well off as their parents or their grandparents are, thanks in part to the operation of the welfare system broadly defined. A lot of the appeal of this current Labor government, I think, to the younger generation consists of an argument about intergenerational fairness. I don't agree with the remedies they propose, but it's not right that a younger generation should look to be poorer than an older generation in a growing and still reasonably capitalist economy. So I think a challenge for the Conservative Party is going to be to come up with ways to address intergenerational fairness that don't revolve around ever higher taxation, ever more regulation, or deliberately impoverishing an older generation for the sake of transferring money to a younger generation. That just repeats the same mistake over again in a different form. That's going to be a tremendous challenge, but unless all of us in the West get that right, we're going to have nothing but the politics of jealousy, envy, and intergenerational resentment for a very long time to come. I don't think that makes for a healthy polity or a healthy politics.
Mark?
Yeah, so I've got a theory about how you might start on this, and it's based on the observation that the electorate's stated preferences are rather different to their revealed preferences. If you do an opinion poll and ask people, would you like to see the National Health Service get much more money? Oh, yes, I mean, that sounds like a terribly good idea. I think I would, actually. And I wouldn't awfully mind, my tax going up in order to pay for it. You can tick that box. But people's revealed preferences, their actual actions, show that they're not really convinced of these propositions. Very, very few people decide to submit to HMRC more tax than they are liable for. You do get a few checks every year coming in, but nobody wants to pay more tax. So my solution, starting point, would be, if that is so, encourage opt-outs. I would be very happy to waive my right to NHS treatment in return for a tax break. I am happy to waive my right to the state pension in return for a tax break on my national insurance contributions. We should go in completely the opposite direction to where Keir Starmer's taking us on private education. That should be a complete write-off against tax, I would suggest. So I think if you actually had, in a range of welfare areas, some over time, like whether I claim a pension in 15 or 20 years' time, and you ask people, you give people the option to say, actually, I don't want the state service, I'd rather run the money myself, then you begin to unravel this ratchet effect. It's not a silver bullet, but it's not a bad bronze bullet, I think.
We went out onto Upper Street in Islington with an iPad and asked people if they wanted to pay more tax. Most of them said yes. We got the iPad out to say, there you go, you can go onto the HMRC website and do it. Nobody wanted to do it.
So, I'm going to move on to Hunter's question. Quick and snappy, what would your slogan be on the broken system, or presumably how to address it?
I look at old election posters from the past, and there's some corkers in there. I think the Tories have done a good job of this in the past. I remember Labour isn't working and all of this kind of thing. So I think they've got a whole back catalogue of good stuff in there that they should rehash, to be honest. Labour isn't working, why not? Let's go with that.
Randolph Churchill speaking in this great city in April 1884, trust the people.
I once ran a campaign called Trust the People, asking for a referendum on a certain thing called the EU. I agree wholeheartedly. David Starkey.
I think that's very good. I've been toying with, again, going back to the riots. The constant slogan was, "We want our country back." There's an extraordinary sense of loss. There's an instinctive sense that things have gone wrong and that they've been taken away. We've again, this is not a slogan, sorry, I'm turning the question round. We've got to get back to people's understanding that the future isn't always the solution. That, in other words, that there is a wisdom. We as Conservatives should be much more confident about talking about earlier solutions. I mean, the Victorians solved so many of these problems. They had no notion of universality. Welfare was the exception, not the rule. We've got to go back to that. We've got to introduce, I'm afraid, the carrot as well as the stick. The Victorians had the absolute principle of less eligibility. That is to say that nobody on welfare received any more than the absolute minimum livable wage. And the reason why we will have to do these harsh things is compassion. Every time I hear the word compassion, I want to reach my revolver. It's the word of easy times. It's the word of too much money. It's the word of no necessity for choice. Those times are over. And the fact is going to become clearer and clearer that they're over. So once again, the fact that we're heading for the nastiest of crashes, in which, as Ted was saying, we're going to see not simply an intergenerational war, we're going to see a deliberate war targeted against the so-called rich. The lines of it are entirely clear as they stand at the moment. People will pull back, I hope. They will recoil. We have to be there to offer something better, and something better than reform, because reform is as dangerously, this is where we've got to say this, is as dangerously unrooted on the right as the Labour Party is on the left. And there's a real danger of what we've been able to avoid in Britain, wonderfully, for the last 300 years, of genuine, nasty revolution. And I'm sorry, I'm choosing these words carefully. We've got to be in the middle, as we always have been. We've got to say that there are better ways of doing things. We've got to be confident of that British way that so many people correctly feel has been lost, has been damaged.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. I mean, to David's point on the Victorian attitude to welfare, you don't even need to go back that far. I encourage you to read the Beveridge report.
Exactly.
A totemic document for the kind of progressive left, in which Beveridge says welfare should be provided at subsistence levels for a temporary period of time.
That's right.
Well, we have definitely veered a long way away from the founding principles of the welfare state. On the slogan, look, Hunter, I don't know, I'd like to think I'm mildly articulate and occasionally can be slightly erudite, but I'm no good at slogans at all, and I'll prove that to you by a lengthy discussion I had about, well, you know, in America they talk about drain the swamp. What's the best we could come up with for a British audience? And the best we could come up with as the British equivalent was empty the bog. And I'm not totally sure that works. But it was our best English equivalent of the drain the swamp.
Sponsored by Dino Rod, yes.
I think we have a winner there.
If you do have more questions, please put your hands up now. If we could start at the back with the gentleman with the glasses.
We talked a lot about the nature...
Sorry, name, please.
Sorry, Peter Kirk, Keith Lear Ilkley Association. We talked a lot about the sort of the nature of conservatism, but obviously the party is only as strong as the people representing it. We've talked a little bit about getting people involved, but what should the party be doing now to pull in those campaigners and legislators, and crucially, ideally, people who can be both, to actually put us in that footing for 2029?
Yes, and the man here with the glasses, and then the man behind him, so that the microphone can just do one trip. If that's okay.
Thank you. Paul Banstead, Altrincham. How should the House of Lords be reformed?
Excuse my voice, I've got a very sore throat, as you probably know. My name is Chris Calver. I'm from Leeds North West, which has now become a Marxist stronghold. And I just wanted to really say, do you think we need to start listening more to people like Arthur Laffer in relation to taxation and actually reducing the number of taxes that we have and have more flat taxes?
Flat taxes.
Perhaps, Ted, if I could start with you on Art Laffer, who you may have come across once or twice, I suspect. And obviously the theory that there is a peak level at which you can tax people, and I think a lot of people in the UK think we've probably already hit it.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I would say that I'm not excited about reaching the peak of the Laffer curve.
Yeah.
I want to be far down the other side of the Laffer curve and take less than the absolute maximum than you can squeeze out of society. It's no good a Conservative Party advocating for the maximum amount of taxation that you can take away from the people. But broadly speaking, yeah, I mean, this is a sort of a bit of economic common sense. Unless labor, and maybe I shouldn't say this, I'll give them ideas, unless labor plans to introduce exchange controls and prevent people from moving money out of the United Kingdom, the UK is already taxing at a rate, thanks to a Conservative government, that is unparalleled even from the era of Clement Attlee. More taxation and more complicated taxation will only encourage people with money to move to lower taxation and or simpler taxation jurisdictions. Of course that's what they're going to do. The City of London was built on precisely the opposite kinds of policies, and I hope that even a Labour government might, after a few years, begin to realize that fact, but I don't doubt it will take a Conservative Party to put it into practice.
And John, I'm going to guess that the Taxpayers Alliance is totally opposed to cutting taxes.
Yeah, no, I've got nothing to say on this. No, we published a report in 2012 called The Single Income Tax, which called for a wholesale reform of the tax system, much simpler, very few, if any, carve-outs, no special exemptions or allowances. So that's the direction we would like to see things go in. George Osborne, in opposition, set up a tax commission and talked a lot about tax simplification, and then in government set up the Office for Tax Simplification. Sorry for all the acronyms, but what actually happened is that when he took office, the tax code was around 11,000 pages, and it's now somewhere around 25,000 pages. I can hear a researcher shouting at me for getting the numbers wrong, but it's roughly in that area. So what's actually happened is taxes have become much more complicated, and lots of the businesses that we speak to would happily trade off a penny and a pound more if taxes were simple and stable, so that they could know roughly in 10 to 15 years' time, this is a decision we can make now, and this is what's going to happen in the future. The constant chopping and changing, and politicians sort of chasing their tails when they introduce new carve-outs is part of the problem. So massive simplification, absolutely. The final point I'd make on taxes, is that there seems to be an SW1, whatever you want to call it, consensus that, you know, we've got to spend this much money. We've just got to find a way to pay for it. But nobody's asking that first question of why are we spending so much money to start with? Why aren't we taking a bit more of an axe to the state? So I don't think you can really talk about tax without going back and addressing that first question on spending, because otherwise we're going to end up with the fiddles, and you see it with the government now. They've promised not to increase income tax, VAT, national insurance. That gives them very, very few options to play with, and the options that they've cited have caused people to leave the country already. Yeah. So we need to address that spending question. So I've said far too much on that.
Perhaps we could move on to House of Lords reform, Dr. Starkey.
I think it's utterly unimportant at the moment. I think what I want to do, I'm sorry, is to go back. Forgive me, Chairman. The essential problem with everything we've been saying is that the Conservative Party, for the last 40 or 50 years, has been hopeless in defending the vital, central importance of private property. And until we recover that, we are lost. We've conceded to the left that your property is held by you simply by the courtesy of the state, that the state knows how to use your property better than you do. Now, until we dare to advance that argument, until we dare to say, actually, people know what to do with their own better, we can argue retail. We can do exactly what everybody's been doing on this table. But until we win that central argument, or at least until we actually place it, I've noticed the room's gone silent. But isn't it the central thing? The basis, if you go back to all classical political theory, if you go right back to Aristotle, the basis of freedom is property. If you go back to the great classical statements, life, liberty, and property, when Jefferson came to mess that up in the Declaration of Independence, he had to replace property because even then he was worried about it. So he had life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which leads directly to Disney and the collapse of America, as Churchill pointed out, going straight from barbarism to decadence without passing through the intervening state of civilization. Civilization depends on the proper use of private property to sustain liberty and freedom of thought. Pardon? Yeah. Yes, and indeed, the whole of our... Right, you're right. Life, liberty, and property was what was worked out by the English in the Middle Ages. Our freedoms are not the result of the European Convention. They will not be the result of an British Bill of Rights. They're intrinsic in our history. We've got to explain this to people. It was our history that actually gives people the ideas of a structured, responsible freedom. We've not defended it. We've not argued it. We've not described it. We've not educated people into it. One of the fundamental tasks of the Conservative Party in this period of opposition, gentlemen asked, how do we make sure that our civil servants, our party members, our bureaucrats begin to embody the programme we're talking about? We've a gigantic task of education, of public education, of ourselves, of our party, and of the country. We should start now.
Agreed. A few very quick thoughts. Chris's point on flat taxes, or at least I would say let's simplify taxes. I mean, very often and rightly we talk about the total tax burden, but the sheer complexity of the tax code is a disaster because it undermines any faith in the system. There are so many loopholes that everybody assumes everybody is on the make and has found a way around it, and that's a complete disaster. So I think, and I mean, the single income tax report, if you haven't read it, from the TPA is well worth reading. Brilliant in-depth investigation of it. But I think I care almost as much about simplifying the tax system as I do about lowering the tax burden. It's vital to be done. Peter's point on the sort of, how do we get these people ready? Well, here are some numbers to conjure with, and I'm encouraged that I don't think this will be done by some CCHQ A-list. But, of course, the parliamentary party tends to break down into cohorts of when they were first elected. So, there's a class of 2010 and a class of 2005. And interestingly, in the Conservative Parliamentary Party, the biggest cohort is the class of 2024. More new Conservative MPs were elected in 2024 than have survived from, there's I think 21 or so of them. If we were to be hugely optimistic, vast amounts of work needs to be done. But let's imagine a world in 5 years' time where we're on the cusp of forming a majority government. This would imply that we're going to make 200, certainly maybe 250 gains in a general election. Who those 250 people are is of monumental importance, because if you can imagine an incoming regime with 250 freshmen, that will be 2/3 of the parliamentary party were we to win the next election. And I don't think there's a centralised way of doing it. I don't want there to be. But there is a duty on all of us to find, identify and support who those 250 people might be, because they will actually be the backbone of the next government, not so much the leader we elect at the moment. On House of Lords reform, I think there was a golden opportunity a year or so ago to pull this off by putting me in the House of Lords. But having missed that once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, I just think the institution's pretty bust now.
I hate to dash everyone's hopes, but I remember talking to a Treasury minister when George Osborne was in number 11 and asked about tax simplification, and the response was, my civil servants tell me it's frightfully complicated to simplify. They're fights we need to keep having, and I know everyone here will be.
Well, the other great, I mean, it's a job for life. Well, it should have been, wasn't it? The Office for Tax Simplification. I don't know if you've just seen the government has just set up the Office for Value for Money in government. I mean, that sounds to me like a job for life as well. They're going to waste so much money that they'll require more and more people to join the Office for Value to Money to, try and audit what's gone wrong.
You've forgotten the other really important new quango that we now have. We have a quango to simplify quangos. I mean, the complete absurdity of our present politics is summarised in that.
I'm going to take one more round of questions. I am going to give you some breaking news that Simon Case has just resigned, in case you hadn't seen it. I liked to make sure that the audience is well informed. Head of the Civil Service. Sorry. So if we could please start with the gentleman there, the lady in glasses there. I can't see where the microphone is. There it is. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, it's Jennifer Scott from Sky News. I just wondered, with the current crop of leadership contenders, who each of you think would do the best job in what you want to see with the Conservative Party, and also which you think would do the worst?
Thank you. Gentleman there.
Thank you very much. Nathan Eckersley, Gross Manchester Conservatives. John and David at the very start spoke very, very passionately and brilliantly about the need for a great repeal act, making sure some of our laws are repealed and making the statute but reduced and lighter. So could I ask each of the panellists for one law you think should be repealed, and then maybe for Ted, one in the US? Thank you.
Thank you. And one more question. If we could have the gentleman just here, thank you.
Hi, thanks. William McCarthy from Edinburgh Conservatives. A lot of the old foundational principles of Britain's constitution grew up in an almost unrecognisable time in terms of economics and demographics. I mean, the principle of parliamentary sovereignty came about before we even had industrial society. And that massive difference, the move from about 4 million people to 60, the move from perhaps a couple £1,000 equivalent GDP per capita to about 50, has going from sort of no civil service at all to an enormous government bureaucracy, has probably motivated, especially for sort of the Blairite-minded reformers, a lot of the changes to our constitution and governmental setup in order to deal with this massive increased complexity that our old institutions simply weren't designed in mind of dealing with. So how would you reconcile the desire to return to a lot of those older fundamental principles of Britain's constitution with that completely unforeseen challenge of massive increased complexity?
Thank you. Well, perhaps we can get over and done who anyone may or may not be supporting for the leadership of the Conservative Party. John.
I'm going to sit on the fence because most Conservative, I think all of them so far have said that they want to lower the tax burden and reduce the size of the state. Music to our ears, but it rarely happens. So they all, from a Taxpayers Alliance perspective, they all talk a good game, but the proof will be in the pudding.
Surely my opinion here is utterly irrelevant, but just for the sake of fun, a consideration or two. along the lines of Mark's argument. Hopefully there will be a lot of new Conservative MPs. In practice, it is going to be CCHQ that is going to spend a lot of time picking which prospective MP is put on the candidates list and which prospective MP gets what constituency. So the next leader of the Conservative Party, in addition to having sound views on tax and a number of other things, should be committed to a thoroughgoing reform of CCHQ. That candidate would have my support if I had any support to give, which I don't.
David Starkey.
Robert Jenrick. Nothing else to be said.
Mark Littlewood.
Yeah, I've pondered this a bit. I think Robert's campaign has been the best of those so far, certainly from getting the sort of argument that David's been putting forth eloquently and I've been putting forward rather less eloquently. I've been impressed by that. But I've decided not to really think about this until we're down to the final two. It's a kind of moot point, so I don't really know what the option would be. And I don't really want to sort of attach myself to a campaign or to someone who can't even technically win. I get enough of that by being a season ticket holder at Southampton Football Club. But I don't need to actually do that in the Conservative leadership race. I'll wait till there's the final two. One law to be repealed, the Town and Country Planning Act 1947. Repeal it.
Yep.
I'll go for Equality Act 2010.
David.
Can I shift to our historic constitution?
Yep.
The point about a historic constitution, ours, is it's unique. In other words, it dealt with modernity. You're quite wrong. We were the only country that was able to broaden the franchise without revolution. Right from the beginning, there was that idea that Parliament binds because everybody is represented there. So when the Chartists wanted representation for the working man, when the skilled working man at the end of the 19th century created his trade unions, when women wanted the vote, they didn't want to tear down Parliament. They wanted a seat in it. The definition of a classic, and I think our Constitution is fundamentally a classic, is that it's an old text that always has something new to say. And it seems to me that everything that we've seen from Blairism demonstrates that this attempt to cope with novelty as being catastrophic. Totally catastrophic. It was presented as a bold, history is on our side, we step into the future. It embraced every decaying piece of nonsense, from Fukuyama to thinking the United Nations is wonderful. If you want an absolutely reliable index to all failure of thought, listen to a speech by David Lammy. And the entire Labour Party is a codification of intellectual failure.
I can see that the crowds are gathering for the next event in here, but I would like to take this opportunity to thank my panel very much for all their insights, and to all of you for being here and making it the event it was, with both the questions but also the interest. Thank you very much. We're beginning to go.